Well, good morning, everyone. Yeah, it's good to see you here. Happy autumn, even though it may not feel like it today. There is no self, and it just won't go away. The first part of that is what I heard my teacher say many years ago. So I thought I would try to find the no self. The harder I tried to find it, the more the self kept showing up. So that's the title of my talk today. That title is very enigmatic, self-contradictory, and that reflects the nature of the self. The self is very self-contradictory and enigmatic. So the Buddhists teach the principle of not self or no self. And most people, including myself, when I first heard this, first read about it, said that's absolutely crazy. You know, how can you say there's no self? I mean, who's reading the book? Who's listening to the words? Who's speaking the words? Of course there's a self. It's the most obvious thing in the world. Well, the Buddha would say, my teaching is not something to be taken as a doctrine or a dogma, but rather it's something to be tested. It's like a hypothesis in science. You don't necessarily believe the hypothesis. You simply test it to see if it's true. And so that's the approach that we take. It's not that anyone is trying to get you to believe, certainly not me, to believe that there's no self. I would say just look for it and see if you find it. Let's explore the nature of the self. When I talk about the self, I'm talking about simply your sense of me, my sense of me. Could be a thought, could be a sensation in the body, could be any number of things. Usually it's a thought and a feeling. So I would invite you to become aware of yourself right now, to look, as my mother used to say, look at yourself. What is your sense of self right now? Now, what was your sense of self before I asked that question? What was your sense of self when you were meditating? What was your sense of self when you were driving here this morning or riding here, you see? And we probably notice that our sense of self comes and goes. Sometimes we're aware of a self. Sometimes we are, quote, lost in whatever's going on in our life. You know, we're watching a movie or reading a book and we're totally engrossed in the movie or the book. No awareness of self. Then somebody calls our name. John, you didn't wash the dishes tonight. Well, the sense of self comes back very quickly. You see, it could be a angry self or a guilty self or whatever, but a sense of self. Typically, when you hear your name, that sense of self shows up. So as we observe the self, and as I invite you to observe self, I won't even call it yourself, just notice how it comes and it goes. And what's it like when you experience self? And what's it like when there's no experience of self? So we practice what's sometimes called self-observation. But that term is not used specifically in Buddhism, simply because it implies there's a self observing a self. In other words, we think when we practice self-observation, typically we kind of split ourselves in half. There's the half that's watching and the half that's doing whatever that half is doing. Sort of like there's a video camera up here watching us, you say. That split between the observer and the observed is a deep, deep assumption in the Western mind, the modern Western mind. It's a deep assumption, and it's a conditioned assumption. It is not reality, you see. We tend to take it as reality itself, and it's not necessarily so. But it's something we assume a priori. That's true. There must be a subject and an object. And that's either reflected and or reinforced by, or both, our language. Whenever we speak, we talk about, I did something, John did something, Mary did something, you see. A subject, verb, and an object. Somebody does something to something or with something or for something, you see. But that's a construct. That's a construct of the mind. And it may be a useful construct, but the problem is we project that outward thinking that is reality itself, that that's the nature of reality. And it is not necessarily so. About 400 years ago, a French philosopher named Rene Descartes did a little thought experiment, and he says, I'm going to doubt that I even exist. How do I know that I exist? Well, he reasoned, I couldn't even, if I didn't exist, I couldn't even question my own existence, right? There's got to be somebody there to question. So if I have a thought, there must be a thinker, basically is what he's saying. The very fact that I'm thinking says there's a me that's thinking. Makes sense, right? Because once again, we split everything into that subject and object automatically. But in the Buddhist tradition, and in the East, and in ancient times, that split was not necessarily assumed. That's actually relatively recent in our human history. Within the past 4 or 5 centuries, that sharp division between inner and outer, subject and object, begin to be entrenched in our collective psyche. Buddhist let me go back and just talk about an example of how our language fits something into a subject and object, even when it doesn't make sense. Okay? So, for example, you look outside and you see rain coming down. And you turn to your partner, your friend, you say, hey, it's raining. Right? And what if she or he said, it's raining, huh? What's raining? What's the it that's raining? You see? We say it's raining because there has to be a subject. We could simply say raining and you'd still understand, you see. Because raining is a process. We don't think in terms of processes. We think in terms of I'm doing something. And that makes all the difference in the world, in the way we view our reality in the Western world. We believe that I have to do something or nothing will happen, rather than seeing life as a process that happens on its own. You know, we say the river flows, right? Show me a river that's not flowing, right? But we have to say the river flows. What we call a river is simply water that's moving. It's a process that's taking place, but we have to say the river is doing something, or it is raining, you see. Sometimes the ancients believed that rain was like God's tears. You know, if it's raining, there's got to be somebody up there making it rain. But why does it rain? Why does the river flow? Because of conditions, because of natural conditions. When conditions are right, it will rain. When conditions are right, the river will flow. And the Buddhists would say the same thing about thinking and seeing and hearing. Thinking is like rain. Thinking is like the river. It occurs. It's a process that happens naturally when conditions are right. So there's this sense of life is happening rather than I'm making my life happen. We even talk about my life. It's not my life. I can't own it. You know, I can't start it and I can't stop it. I can only live it or not live it, you see. But it's always unfolding. So thinking is not personal. It arises out of conditions. And so the Buddhist would say, so the self, the sense of self, arises out of conditions. When the conditions are that I'm watching a movie and I'm lost in the movie, there's no sense of self. And when somebody calls my name, that's another condition, and then the self will arise. You see? If I'm sitting listening to a Dharma talk or a lecture, and all of a sudden, you know, there's no sense of self, let's say. I'm engrossed in the Dharma talk because it's so great and so brilliant. Just teasing. And then all of a sudden, I or somebody would point to you and call your name. You see, and then, bam, all of a sudden, self comes back. So just noticing self arises like conditions. You know, in human life, life arises in certain conditions. And life ends under certain conditions. You see? It may be helpful, I believe it's helpful to think of self not so much as a noun, but as a verb. Thinking of self as an activity. Self is simply a particular expression of the life unfolding in this moment. So it's like the universe is selfing. As Robert, it's selfing as Robert, it's selfing as Victor, it's selfing as Michael, selfing as Nicoya. Or it's not selfing, you see, based on conditions. Self is verb. If you've ever been the parent of a 2-year-old, it's easy to imagine self as verb because a 2-year-old is in constant action, you see. But we're still in constant action in terms of our awareness of self. Sometimes I used to, when I taught Sunday school many years ago, and I would say to the kids, okay, what's this? And they would say, well, that's a fist. You know, fist is a noun, right? If you look it up in the dictionary, fist will be a noun. It's a thing. It's an object. So I'm going to do a little magic trick. I do this for the kids. Where'd it go? Where did the fist go? You know? I mean, it was a thing, right? It's a noun, a thing. Fist. But it's just disappearing. You say, I have nothing up my sleeves. There's no mirrors up here. So, fist, of course, is simply a particular posture of the hand. So there's really no such thing as a fist. It's simply the hand fisting, right? So in that same sense, there's no such thing as the self. There's simply life selfing. So life selfs occasionally, and then it unselfs. You know, self is one person, and then that person is no longer aware of self. Someone else may be aware of self. You see? So just noticing your sense of self and feel in your body. When we feel the body, when we look at the mind, we experience the self not as a thing, but as a river, as a series of activities. Now, I'm going to say something that is really important, is that not self doesn't mean you don't exist. Not self means, in a way, you exist even more than when you're a self. You know, the hand is much more useful when it's not fisting. When the hand is stuck in a fist, it doesn't work very well. It may work for a few things, but not for very many things. But when the hand is alive and mobile, then it can do a whole lot that it can't do when it's stuck in a fist. So you were actually more of who you really are when you're in no self than when you're in self. Because who you really are, what you really are, is an expression of the universal life, the universal intelligence. The metaphor that's often used is like a wave on the ocean. A wave on the ocean. We have a term called wave. But a wave is not a thing, it's simply the ocean waving. Okay? It's an activity of the ocean. You are an activity of the universal ocean. And as such, you have the perfect response to whatever needs to happen in your life. When we're in that place, sometimes it's called the zone, but it's any time that we're not caught up in our sense of self that we can respond according to whatever we need to. We have what I call the perfect response mechanism because it's really a part of who we are. So I want to close with this particular story as an example of what I'm talking about. I was in a program some years back where there were about 100 people in this room, and the teacher says, I want to demonstrate something. He says, I want the biggest klutz in the room to come forward, please. So are there any klutzes out there, you know? And so Right away, there was a woman in the back, young woman in the back, stood up and waved her hand, and she came up, and he says, "Are you a klutz?" She said, "No, the world's greatest, you know." And so he said, "Okay, what I'm going to do, we're going to get about 10 feet apart, and I'm going to take this tennis ball, and I'm going to just toss it to you very gently, and I want you to catch it." Okay. So he tossed the ball to her very gently, and it bounced off her shoulder. So he tossed it again. He says, "No, I want you to keep your eye on it. I want you to try as best you can to catch it." He tossed it again, bounced off her forehead. The next one bounced off her nose. 0 for 10. And afterwards, there was kind of a smile on her face, and she said, "See, I told you I'm a klutz." She validated her belief. He said, "Now, I'm going to do something else." He says, "I don't want you to try to catch the ball. Don't catch the ball. Just notice that the next game is I'm going to toss the ball. You tell me which direction the ball is spinning." "Oh, okay." So he tossed the ball, spinned it like this. She caught the ball and said, "Well, it's spinning this way." He says, "That's right." And then he tossed it this way. "It's spinning this way." "Yeah, okay." He kept doing that, spinning it different ways. And afterwards, he said to her, "Did you notice anything different the second time we did it?" She said, "No." And he said, "Did you know that you caught the ball 10 times out of 10? She says, "No, I didn't." She said, "No, I didn't. I couldn't have." And he looked at her and he says, pointed to the people in the audience, about 100 of us, "Ask them if you caught the ball." And of course, we all said, "Yeah, you did, 10 out of 10. And this woman was stunned. I mean, she almost staggered back to her chair. When she was outside of the story of self, as a klutz, the conditioned self, her body knew how to catch the ball. She didn't even have to try. In fact, it was the trying that was getting in the way, you see. When we stop trying and we allow life to move through us as no self, or as selfing as a verb, then we live in a whole new dimension, a whole new range of being. And I could say a whole lot more about this, but time doesn't permit. But yeah, so don't be afraid to be no self. It's really a pretty cool thing. And I appreciate your practice. I'm glad you're here this morning. And thank you for sharing the Dharma with us in your practice.